In this video, we'll look at a new type of value, the Boolean type. We've looked at numeric types and also container types. So far, what we've looked at are int, float, string, and also list, tuple, and set. And now we're going to add a seventh type, the Boolean type. I believe we may have also mentioned the none type. That would be a seventh. This will be our eighth. The Boolean type. Boolean type object is true or false. So if we run this code, for example, we'll see we get class bool and class bool. Bool is the name of the type. It means true or false. And as you saw previously in some of our assignments, but as you're seeing here now, true and false are spelled with capital letters. They are the words true or false. We certainly never want to put them inside quotes because that would mean that they'd be strings. And they have their own type, their Boolean type. Now, we work with Booleans quite a lot, even if we're not looking at true or false, because if we look at a test, like for example, B greater than A. Is B greater than A? Yeah, I would say so. So then B greater than A is a value that is a Boolean value. B greater than A actually returns true or false. We understand this to be just what happens when you compare one value to another. We may want to compare one string to another, let's say for equivalence. And that would be true too. But the truth is, any comparison like this returns a true or false value. So we could even print B greater than A, and we would find that it was true. Because the value itself that comes back from B greater than A is true. We could even go ahead and assign this value. Not that we would, and this is all just play at this point. And we could print C and the value of C, or rather the type of C, and we'd see true and bool. And that's because we assigned the comparison to a name. The comparison itself returns the value. But here's something really interesting. Although this is true, and this is very easy to grok, the truth is that if we were to check on the value of the object itself in a true value expression or a true false expression, we'll find that the value B is true. Now this might seem a little bit strange, but there are many cases, many examples throughout the use of various languages where to check the value of an object to see whether it's more or less empty or not, we put it in an if expression. So we may very frequently see if A or if B in an expression. Now, I'm not expecting you to use this because most students don't default to using this. If you wanted to check, to see if B had any value in it or something, you'd probably compare it to 0 or something. But the truth is that any value in a Boolean expression will return true or false. For example, let's take the Boolean conversion of B. This would be similar to what we're doing in the if expression. So if I check the Boolean value of B, I'll find that it's true. Strange. Yes, the Boolean value of B is true because any value in Python can be converted to Boolean. And that is exactly what was happening when we said if B. You see, an if expression checks for true or false, right? And if you put a comparison in there, it will return true or false. But if does more than that, and this would also be true of elif and while. If we put a variable in an if expression, it gets converted to Boolean. That means it gets converted to a true or false value. Now you may remember that we had various ways of converting values. I could convert B to an int. I could convert A to a float. I could convert any one of these to a string. and you know what we're going to get. In the case of an int of a float, we get the fractional value lopped off. In the case of an int converted to float, we just add the point 0 and make it into a float. And in the case of any kind of value converted to a string, we can more or less put quotes around it. That's how these conversion functions work. But the Boolean conversion function actually converts a value to true or false, which of course brings up a big question. If you can convert any value to true or false, what makes a value true or false? And I'll tell you. Any value that is empty or 0, any value that's empty or 0 will read as false. It'll convert to Boolean as false. And any value that is not empty or not 0 will be seen as true. And this means that if I had a very small number, for example, it will be true. If I have a negative number, it will be true. If I have a 0 number, whether it's an int or a float, it will be false. So the rule that we can write down here is that any value can be seen as true or false. The rule is if the value is 0 or empty, it is false. Otherwise, it's true. Now, what do I mean by 0 or empty? Obviously, for integers, 0 means 0, and anything other than 0 is not 0. So anything other than 0 would be true, and anything that is equivalent to 0 would be false. Doesn't matter if it's negative or positive or very small. It'll always be true unless it's 0. But what does empty mean? Well, empty refers to the containers. So if we have an empty container, that'll be false. Great. So we have an empty list here. That reads as false. If we put something in the list, that reads as true. Now, notice that I put zeros inside my list, and you might think of those as false values. That might lead you to consider that the list might be false, but the fact is an empty list just means it has nothing in it. An empty list has nothing in it. That means it'll be false. But if it has anything in it, even none, even 0, it'll be seen as true. Even one single 0 will make it true. And this will be true of the other containers as well. A set with zeros in it, a tuple with zeros in it, a dictionary, which we're going to look at in the next video, with zeros in it would be true. So when we look at a list like this, we just have to ask if it has anything in it. I could even have a single item of false. How can we think of this as true if it has a false value in it or a 0 value? Here's the rule. Think of it as checking its len. So what's the len of a list if it has one? Well, let me ask you, what is the len of a list if it has 2 false values in it? Well, it has 2 items, and the first item is false and the second item is false, but the list has 2 items. Well, that makes it true. That means a len of 2, and that means it's not empty. So remember the rule. If any value can be seen as true or false, if the value is 0 or empty. So 0 would refer to our integers and floats, but empty would refer to our containers. If the container doesn't have anything in it, it's false. Otherwise, it's true. So let's look at a set that has 0, 0, false. Well, I guess second 0 is redundant there. This set has 0 and false. Is this going to be true or false? Well, consider the len. The set has 2 items in it. Therefore, it is true. It's not empty. That's the only rule that you need to think of. Now you may ask, well, why don't I just check the len? I mean, why would I want to use an idiom like if x, if really what I mean is if len x is not equal to 0? That's really what I'm asking when I'm asking whether this container is true or not. You're right, it's a little more explicit to put it this way. It's also explicit, for example, when you're working with, let's say, an integer, to ask, if we were to work with an integer, for example, you might be just asking if it's unequal to 0. If it's not 0, that reads as true. If it's equal to 0, then that reads as false. Sure. I'll tell you, the reason we use this idiom is that it's just very common. And really, honestly, once you start working with it, it just really becomes very easy. So you'll say something like if x. And if you wanted to check to see if x had nothing in it, maybe you want to see that if it's 0, you might say if not x. If not x means if it's not false. In other words, if not x, meaning, I guess I reversed those incorrectly. If not x, meaning if it is false, if it is false. Now again, it might take a little while to get used to an idiom like this, but you are likely to see it. We're probably not going to use it that much in this class, but I wanted to give you a heads up about booleans. So normally at this point I give a quiz. I'll probably do it in class, so if you want to bone up on it now, you can. The question for each one of these is it true or not? Now I want you to remember that for integers and floats, it's a question of whether it's 0 or not. If it's 0, it's false. Otherwise, it's true. For containers, however, remember, if it has any length at all, and this will be true of strings as well, which I didn't even mention. Strings are true if they have anything in them. False otherwise. So here's an empty string. This should read as false. Why don't I reverse these again? So x is going to read as false. I should mention that if we put a 0 into x, what is the length of x? It's 1. It might have a 0 in it, but it's 1. So a string that has even one character in it is true. And even one that contains spaces is going to be true. Only the empty string will be seen as false. So then looking at the quiz, consider that if it's an integer or a float, only 0 is false. And if it's a string or other container, and you can think of a string as a container for this purpose, if it's empty, if it has nothing in it, then it's false. Otherwise, anything else, if it has anything else, it's true. So I'm going to read through these very, well, not too slowly. You pause if you need to come up with your own answer first. Var. Var is integer 5, that's true. Var 2, integer 0, that would be false. Var 3, negative 1, that would be true. Var 4, a very tiny number, but not 0, that would be true. Var x, 0, but it's a string, and the string has one character, therefore true. Var 5, true. Var 6, that's a double quoted string, but it's empty, false. Var 7, that's a string that has multiple spaces in it. That's true. It has a length of 3 or 4 there. Var 8, this is a list, but what's inside of it? Now you might think that there were spaces inside of it, but I'm here to tell you. If the list had a string with spaces in it, you would see quotation marks. So that list doesn't have anything in it. This was a trick. Var 8, which is 2 brackets, I'm just using space syntactically. That's syntactic space, meaning it doesn't have any real meaning. It's just there for style. And I was tricking you. Var 8 is a list with nothing in it, and so that's false. Var 9, a list with 2 items, true. Var 10, a list with 1 item. Doesn't matter if it's a 0. One item, that makes it true. var 11 is a dictionary, and we'll go over that in the next unit. That's a one key value pair dictionary. That is true because it has a length of 1. And var 12, empty dictionary, not an empty set. An empty set is done with the set constructor. That's an empty set. An empty dictionary is length 0, therefore false.